exposure compensation, and aperture and shutter speed priority modes, or AV and TV. Let's set to AV mode first. Input the ISO setting manually. Let's use ISO 250 for this example. Aperture priority mode allows the user to set the aperture, and the camera will set or pair this aperture with a shutter speed setting which can deliver a correct exposure. Note that the user have set an aperture value of f5.6. The camera will automatically set a shutter speed value of 1/13 of a second to get the normal exposure, or 0 EV. Let's now use the exposure value compensation feature of the camera, which will override the automatic camera settings. By using this feature, the settings given by the camera will be changed and the settings from the user is kept, i.e., the aperture and ISO value. He can make the image dark by bringing the exposure meter to a negative value, and the camera will automatically set the appropriate shutter speed. We can see now that the camera gave a faster shutter speed of 1/25th of a second to achieve a dark image. Let's try to make the image even darker. At this point, the camera set the shutter speed at 1/50th of a second so we can achieve a much darker image at -2 EV. Let's now try making the image bright by bringing the exposure meter at +1 EV. Here, the camera set the shutter speed at 1/6 of a second to get that +1 EV, or a bright shot. Let's make it even brighter by bringing the exposure meter to +2 EV. And for this, the shutter speed set by the camera is 0.3 seconds for the +2 EV. An even simpler way to shoot in AV mode or aperture priority mode and use the exposure compensation feature is by setting the ISO to auto. With this, user will set the aperture value and the camera will set both the shutter speed and ISO value. With the exposure value set by the user at f5.6, the camera set the shutter speed to 1/40th of a second and the ISO to ISO 1000 to get a normal exposure, or 0 EV. Again, using exposure compensation, let's make the image brighter by bringing the exposure meter to +1 EV. Here, the camera still set the shutter speed to 1/40th of a second but increased the ISO to ISO 2000. Let's see what happens when we use the exposure compensation to +2 EV. For +2 EV compensation, the camera set the shutter speed to 1/30th of a second and the ISO to ISO 3200. Let's now try to make the image dark. For a -1 EV compensation, the camera set the shutter speed to 1/50th of a second and ISO to ISO 640. And for -2 EV, the camera set it at 1/50th of a second shutter speed and ISO 320. To recap, in AV or aperture priority mode, user sets or dictates the aperture value, then the camera will set the shutter speed. It will also set the ISO if it is set to auto ISO. User can then choose to make the image darker or brighter through exposure compensation. The next priority mode is the TV or shutter speed priority mode. In case you're wondering, TV stands for time value, which refers to shutter speed. In contrast to AV mode, shutter speed priority mode means that the user sets the shutter speed and the camera sets the aperture. Let's try this mode. Let's first try it with the user setting the ISO to ISO 250. As you can see, user sets shutter speed and the camera sets the aperture. We can see here that for a normal exposure or 0 EV, the camera set f2.5 aperture to pair with the shutter speed of 1/60th of a second which the user set. Let's make the image darker through exposure compensation. At -1 EV, the camera set the aperture to f3.2. Let's see what happens if we make it brighter. For a +1 EV, the camera set the aperture to f1.8. Let's now set the ISO to auto and allow the camera to set both the aperture and ISO while the shutter speed is kept by the user at 1/60th of a second. Let's observe how aperture and ISO values change as the exposure compensation is used. There you have it. That is how exposure compensation works. Now it's your turn to try it out. Happy shooting!